Turn with me to the 12th chapter of the book of Mark. This morning I'd like to take just a few minutes to have us consider an important subject. And what I'd like to talk about this morning for just a few minutes is our dependence upon God. Dependence upon God. This is a very notable chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters in all of Mark. And after there's these wonderful things that our Lord says, this is shortly before his crucifixion. So, we're getting real close. Everything's coming to a head here. But the Lord is still in the temple, and he's been teaching, and now he's sitting and he's watching. And he sees something happen that, though it was a very insignificant person, it was a very significant act. It says in verse 41, "And Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. There came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and saith unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast more in than all they which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living." Now, y'all are familiar with this. We talk about the poor widow's mites and so on, but to set the scene, the Lord has spent the better part of the day having discussions, making pronouncement, teaching in the temple. He's now perhaps resting. He's standing over on the side in this area called the treasury. The treasury was this large courtyard area outside the temple as those who came to worship. And the Jews, of course, were required to make certain offerings to pay for the upkeep of the temple. But there were also praise givings or charity givings, love offerings that could be made, and there were various types of chests. Sometimes they were called trumpets. There were these large vessels with sort of a narrow neck and an opening that you could throw the money into. We're familiar with those kinds of devices where people are trying to collect money for different causes. And so part of the religious worship would be to come in and make a donation, and the monies might be earmarked for one cause or another. None of that's important, other than just to understand that this was in the midst of this going on. It will bring to mind talking about how those who are rich like to jangle their coins as they're on their way to make such a donation, and Jesus alludes to that here. But then as he's watching, and of course the Lord knows everything, but he notices and observes a poor widow woman. And we have some poor widow women here, but not like this woman, because this woman in these days, she really was destitute. She had no one to care for her, and there was not much of a social safety net to provide for her. I'm glad that we have those things. I might complain at times about the taxes or the administration of them, but I am glad that we as a society try to help our elderly and our poor and so on. I mean, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But none of that, whether you like it or not, they didn't have it. And so here's a woman who is just like the woman that Elijah encounters back in 1 Kings chapter 17. She's very impoverished. She's very straight, very distressed, very, very, very much in a position where she must depend on the Lord. And yet notice what she does. She takes 2 mites. And if you're wondering what a mite is, well, Mark tells us 2 mites are a farthing. Okay, that's if you ever want to know, it's a half a farthing. It's this very small coin. Okay, it's a very small amount of money. Perhaps it was the smallest denomination, a couple of pennies, we might think. And that's all she had. But she cast it in to the treasury. And the Lord, observing this, points out, he calls his disciples over to him and he says, "You see that woman there? Okay. That woman has cast in more into the treasury than anybody else here today. In fact, she's cast in more than all of the other contributions that have been taken today combined. And the reason is because all those other contributions were taken out of their other people's abundance. But this woman made this contribution out of her want, out of her lack of provision. Now you got to say the question, why would a woman do that? And I can tell you, even though the word dependence does not appear in the Bible per se, the idea of it certainly does. It was because she depended on God at a level that none of us do. You know why? Because she had to, okay? But she knew some things through that sorrow. We immediately look at a story such as this, and if we're honest with ourselves, we're not honest with each other, and we might not be honest with ourselves. None of us would want to be in that state, to be so poor that 2 mites was a lot of money, and then yet being motivated to put that in the treasury. God is not a bank. I'm not a prosperity preacher. I'm not saying you put in 2, you get 4. Okay, you put in 4, you get 8. That's not the principle here at all. So don't let your mind go there. But there is a sense in which she put in all, and she received all. But the only reason that this was able to happen is because she truly was desperate. She understood her need. And in some ways, she was the richest person in that courtyard. That's the true riches. Being able to give up our own self-need, our own self-desire to be in charge, to direct our paths, to truly get to the point where we say to the Lord, not just in words, but it's our heart's desire, Lord, however you want these things to turn out, that's what I want. Whatever you want of me, Lord, I will do. Whatever you require of me, Father, I will give. And wherever you lead me, I will go. That is a very hard thing to say. This woman was saying that. The Lord put that on her heart. She knew, because logic tells you that if a widow woman's down to her last 2 mites, she ought to spend that on some food, right? But something put it, and I say something, someone put that on her heart. You know that. The Lord watched this. He knew she was coming. He was the one who put that. But this is how the Lord interacts with us. We depend upon Him, and He shows us mighty things. And the more we can understand that we really do need to work on depending upon Him, we're really not getting it yet. I've seen in my life where I've gone through periods of sorrow. I've gone through periods of struggle. I've gone through periods of time where I didn't feel like I was committing any gross, egregious sin or anything else. It was just a cloud of sorrow, a cloud of depression, a cloud of I'm burdened, and I'm just trying to make it through, okay? And I know that many of you have gone through that. Maybe some of you are going through that now. So maybe we've talked about people who are going through physical sickness and area. What I want to remind you of is that whatever we receive from the hand of the Lord, it's thankworthy, whether it be bitter or it be sweet. I'm not saying that God is the author of sin. I'm not saying that every bad thing that happens to you is God's, but He obviously you have to admit that God had to allow it. And whatever happens, God's purpose is, He has a purpose. And His purpose is to train you, to take you through where you are now into a place where He's going to bless you. The book of Ecclesiastes starts out this way. For everything under heaven, there is a time or a season. For everything and every purpose under heaven. And he says there's a time to die and there's a time to live. There's a time to plant. There's a time to gather. There's a time of war, time of peace, right? All of that. Time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together, so on. We've preached on that. I don't care about quoting it correctly. I want to bring to mind this idea of seasons in our lives. And it doesn't work where God says, okay, you're going to have a bad time for a while, and then you're going to have a good time. Then you're going to have a bad time. Then you're going to have it doesn't work that way. But what does happen is we do move through seasons. And sometimes these seasons are difficult. But what God is doing is He's refining us so that we will perceive our dependence upon Him. You cannot depend upon God without suffering. You can't. It's just not possible for us. The way that we're made, we must go through suffering in order to understand firsthand how much we truly depend upon Him. And if you look back on your life, you'll see where there were times whenever you were in great straits and the Lord delivered you, right? And that's thankworthy. That's a cause of to be thankful. We've got to understand that when we're being led by the great shepherd of the sheep, He really does love us. And He really does care for us. And He really does bring us along. And He does teach us things. And sometimes the only way we can learn these things is through suffering. But this woman was desperate. She was in a place of total and complete dependence upon God. God help us all to get to that same place where we are truly looking to Him. And the only way we're going to get there is through the experiences that we encounter from time to time. That's why whenever you encounter someone who is going through a difficult time, if you've gone through that difficult time too, you can share with them a little bit of your experience. You can say, sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so, instead of just saying, well, I'll pray for you, and you ought to do that. But you can say, look, I understand what you're going through. These are some things that the Lord did in my life and how He brought me through. And He set things up that didn't make any sense to me. And if you're paying attention, the more the Lord will bring you along. You'll begin to realize that God's starting to do things sometimes that make no sense whatsoever. You just trust Him, and you just wait, and you be faithful, and you ask for His will, and you say, Lord, don't let me do anything that's outside your will. You show me your will, and I'm content to wait, I'm content to move, I'm content to act. You show the way. And that's the kind of discipleship that the Lord is drawing out of us. I found it interesting or notable, these words in Psalm 18. Psalm 18, this was written by David. Scholars differ on when it was written, but it looks to me like it was probably written sometime in the middle part of his life. We know that David himself went through a lot of suffering, a lot of sorrow. He was chased all over the wilderness by King Saul, who wanted to kill him. We know that he had rebellion in his own household. He had a lot of suffering, some of it which he brought upon himself, others that he did not. But here in Psalm 18, he expresses his love for God, and he expresses the fact that I was in distress. And when I was in distress, God, when it was the appointed time, when it was the appropriate time, when God was ready, He moved heaven and earth to deliver me. Let's begin reading. This is a long psalm. It's 50 verses. David had a lot to be thankful for, okay? I will love Thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation, and my high tower. He's my shield. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. There's a little children's song. Maybe you were humming that while I was reading that. It's good that it's a children's song. It's also a warrior's song. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me, or went before me, or surrounded me. But then look at this. In my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of His temple, and my cry came before Him, even into His ears. Now, how did David know that? Well, if you'll continue reading this psalm, I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it, but I encourage you to do that. He begins to, with this majestic language, begin to say, the Lord got up, and He thundered, and He shook the earth, and He shook the heavens, and He came down forth, and He speedily delivered me. And that's the Lord that we serve today. He will do that for you and for me when He's ready. Deliverance is promised. Maybe not the way you expect to be delivered. And you see, that's the really funny thing here. One of the things that David knew, he had been promised, he had been anointed as king. So he knew he was going to be king, right? So he did have that. Just like you all know that you're going to live in heaven, you've got that promise. But there's a lot of uncertainty between here and there. And one of the things that I've noticed in my own life and in other people's as well, when I'm talking to them about their problems or we're going through an issue, and these are real problems and real issues, and I'm not making fun of it, but you have to admit that a lot of times when you've got something going on in your life, a family problem or a work issue or something else, you always say, all right, Lord, and you might not say it out loud, but you might say, all right, Lord, here's where I want to wind up. Or, of course, here's where I'm going to wind up. Obviously, this is where I'm going to wind up. Now, Lord, I'm willing to take any path that you want me to take. We can go this way, we can go that way. But, to here. And that here can be anything. That here can be, well, obviously, we live in Oklahoma City, so obviously we're still going to live there. We're still going to have the same house we have. Obviously, our kids are going to go to church or whatever. You just fill in the blank. Whatever that is, if you've got a thumbtack in your mind kind of saying it, you need to take that thumbtack and you need to throw it away. You just got to get rid of it. That's not what you pray. And this takes a long time. You say, Lord, I have no clue where you're taking me. I have no idea where you're going to call me to do or have me do tomorrow, much less 10 years from now. I know that I should be making plans. I should not tempt you. I should, try to, pay my bills and do the things. But Father, if you want to do something, have me do something entirely different, way outside of even what I expect, Father, do it. Because don't you see that if we're depending upon Him, we're willing to say that. If you are depending upon God, you don't have a lot of other options. And we have to voluntarily submit to Him at that level. David did. And that's one of the reasons why you go through difficulties. God's not sending you through difficulties. It's not allowing you to suffer the loss of a loved one or a painful injury or horrible depression or difficulties at work or whatever. He's not doing that because He enjoys it, but He does enjoy you turning to Him. All right? And all I can say is that be thankful. Be thankful that you're going through problems. Be thankful. You know why? Because if every one of us had the life that we wish we had, a life of ease, we would fall apart. Not a single one of us would be faithful members of this church. If you had all the money you wanted, you'd say, Father, I'd do all this stuff for you. Maybe you're an exceptional case, but I don't think so. God knows that we must, in this life, in order for us to maintain control over our own flesh and to walk in the Spirit, we have to be dependent upon God. And you're only going to get dependent upon God by going through, from time to time, suffering. It's just the way it is. What did our Master tell us? In this world ye shall have tribulation. It's a fact. But be of good cheer, because I have overcome the world. And you can look through the Bible and see all sorts of examples. What I'm telling you is true. Think about every single famous person, Bible person, Old Testament or New, just about everyone that I can think of went through some sort of difficulty, some sort of trial. Abraham did, Isaac did, Jacob went through a lot of them, right? Joseph, right? The other children of Israel, the entire nation as it was in slavery, enslaved by the Egyptians, Moses, Aaron, David, obviously, I just read from David, Solomon, everybody. Even Daniel's life was threatened, in the first chapter. Nobody gets out of this. So why is it? And in the New Testament, same. Paul, think about Paul. What does the Lord say to Paul? I'm going to show you what great things you're going to suffer for my name's sake. Why? Because God's angry with Paul? Or is God bestowing a special, particular level of favor upon Paul? See, that's a different way of thinking about this. Christianity is not for the faint of heart. It's not for wimps. You got to step up. Okay? And if the Lord's putting you through something right now that's kind of difficult and you don't quite understand, well, maybe He's just kind of saying, look, I've got something that I've got planned for you. But there's some lessons I need you to learn. And one of the lessons I need you to learn, you really do need to depend on me. You need to quit. You need to quit saying, Lord, I kind of in the back of my mind know that this is how things are going to work out. My wife and I are going to grow old and we're going to, go on a cruise and we're going to do, you know what? You're not going to take your next breath without him. Okay? So let's turn to him. And there's freedom in this. That widow woman was the happiest person, and at least the most joyful person, because her eyes were open. She could see reality. God help us that we might be able to see reality. In closing, I'm going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul relates some of this. Paul, early in his ministry, was given a great vision. He was allowed to be caught up into the third heaven. We understand that to be the throne room of God. That's the same thing we're seeing in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. Many people in the Bible, as it turns out, both in the Old Testament, were allowed to see this. Daniel did, and Ezekiel did, and Isaiah did, and Paul did, and John did. But anyway, it says, it's not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. It says, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell. God knoweth. He's talking about himself. He says, I was going along one day, minding my own business, walking with the Lord, and suddenly I was swept up. And I don't know if it was me. I don't know if this was a vision. I don't know if I was actually there. I don't know if I was watching this happen. This is what he's explaining. He said it was the strangest thing that ever happened to me. But he says, I don't know if I was in the body, out of the body. I was watching myself, but yet I was experiencing it. He was caught up into heaven. And that's what it's like to be there, because it's so splendorously glorious. But notice what it says. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Now we've heard say that there were things that he was said that he could not repeat. That's in the book of Revelation. Or it could be just say that I don't have the ability to describe it. I don't care about that. The point is, that doesn't matter. Just read the words. He wasn't allowed to express to us everything that he saw. But he says, of such a one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seemeth to be, or that he heareth of me. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. We talk about being caught up onto the mountaintop. Paul really was. I mean, the biggest mountain there is. He was caught up into heaven. You imagine how much that must have filled him with joy, how much that must have transformed his life. He must have understood. You guys, when I preach to you about heaven, you have no idea what awaits us. And I preach to you about the glory of Jesus Christ. Wait till you see him. I mean, I can't express it to him. Obviously, you can see how that would be a great boon to someone who was out there trying to preach the gospel to God's little sheep, and that's a good thing. But God saw fit, in his infinite wisdom, to allow Paul to be afflicted heavily. It says there was a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to buffet him. We don't know what it was. It's meaningless to suggest what it was or sit around. If you want to speculate, that's fine. Doesn't matter. Pay attention to the words. The words are, it hurt. It was very distracting. It was very, very painful. This was suddenly, Paul went from up here to way down here. This was something that kept him from sleeping maybe. He was buffeted. It was not just a small issue. This was a significant, stressful thing for Paul, so much so that he went to the Lord multiple times. God, please take this from me. I don't know what you're doing, but take this from me. And he said he besought him 3 times for that. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he, that is the Lord, said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. My strength is made perfect. It's perfected. It finds its fullness and application in your weakness, in your weakness, in my weakness, okay? My dependence. The widow woman, remember the widow woman? Very, very weak from the world, but very, very powerful in the spiritual realm. So much so that the Lord of glory took notice of her and gave her as an example to the rest of us. This is what kingdom living is about. This is where I want us to go. This is where we need to go, because it's that. This is what it means to follow Christ. So notice what Paul concluded from this. He said, okay, I get it, Lord. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Because I think that Paul began to realize that though he was he was suffering greatly, he began to realize that it was the Lord that got him through the day. It was the Lord that gave him the strength to be able to get up out of bed and go and do everything. He began to realize how dependent he really is upon the Lord. And you know what? It caused him to rejoice. He says, much more gladly will I glory in mine infirmities, because that the power of Christ may rest upon me. You learn more about the Lord whenever you're in distress. You learn more about him when you're dependent upon him. It says, therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And we need to understand that you're never strong. You know, Jesus says this. He says, without me, you can do nothing. That's literally true. Paul also says in the Philippian letter, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Let's understand from where our help comes, where our strength comes. It only comes through dependence. It gives us a different way to look at this. Let's all quit being headstrong and quit having this idea of where we want to be and assume that that's where the Lord would have us. Let's ask him and be willing to follow him wherever he goes. I hope you all have a stressful day in the sense that Paul's talking about. God bless you.